I'm going to pivot to the topic of Ukraine. What made you so prescient about what was going to unfold in Ukraine? I mean, you started talking about this 7 or 8 years ago. That's the first part of the question. The second part is, to the extent that you were so prescient in painting the future of Ukraine 7 or 8 years ago, how is it that people in Washington were not listening or paying attention to the stuff that you were saying?
I believe, as a good realist,
right,
that if you take a military alliance like NATO, that was a mortal foe of the Soviet Union during the Cold War,
yep,
and you take that alliance after the Cold War ends, and you move it up to Russia's borders, that the Russians are going to view this as an existential threat. That's just good old-fashioned realist logic. Here in the West, in the United States, we have the Monroe Doctrine. We do not want any other great powers in the Western Hemisphere. That's what the Monroe Doctrine says. Great powers cannot form military alliances with countries in the Western Hemisphere, and they can certainly not move military forces into the Western Hemisphere. This is why we had the Cuban Missile Crisis.
right.
The same basic logic applies to the Russians. The Russians are thinking like hard-headed realists. They see this alliance, which was once a mortal foe, moving closer and closer and closer. The Russians make it unequivocally clear after April 2008, when we say that we are going to incorporate Ukraine into NATO, that we are going to incorporate Ukraine into the EU, that we are going to foster an orange revolution in Ukraine and make Ukraine a pro-Western liberal democracy, that this is categorically unacceptable. This is what the Russians say.
Right.
It makes perfect sense to me. Therefore, I think what the United States should do, or should have done, was backed off. Because the problem is that if the United States persists, what the Russians will do is they'll wreck Ukraine. And the Russians make it unequivocally clear that they will wreck Ukraine. Do the United States policymakers listen to them? In the Bush administration, in the Obama administration, in the Trump administration, in the Biden administration? No, they ignore them. And they continue to push and push and push. And in 2014, February 2014, the crisis breaks out. This is when the Russians take Crimea, and you have the start of a civil war
right.
in the Donbass region
right.
of Ukraine. And then, of course, on February 24th of 2022, 8 years later, you have a huge war
right.
that's now going on. And from my point of view, it was perfectly obvious that this was going to happen after we announced in April 2008 that Ukraine would become part of NATO. And there was just all sorts of evidence available to American policymakers that should have made them hesitate. And certainly after 2014, American policymakers should have backed off, but instead we doubled down. And Joe Biden, it's important to emphasize, has always been especially hawkish on Ukraine. He handled the Ukraine portfolio in the Obama administration, and he was a super hawk on Ukraine. So when he becomes president in January of 2021, what he does is double down. And the end result is that we have this war. Now, you asked the question, why didn't American policymakers listen to me or listen to the Russians and listen to all those other people?
Right.
It's not just me. You want to understand that April 2008 at Bucharest, both Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy, the German and French leaders respectively.
Recipe for disaster.
Yep.
Yeah.
Angela Merkel has recently said, this is amazing. She has recently said that the reason she was opposed to what happened at Bucharest in April 2008 is because she understood that Putin would see our claim that Ukraine would become part of NATO as a declaration of war. Just think about that.
Wow.
Merkel said that. So it's not just John Mearshimer. It was Angela Merkel, Nicolas Sarkozy. Back in the 1990s, it was people like George Kennan. It was Bill Perry, who was the Secretary of Defense. It was General Shali Shakvili, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Right.
All sorts of people warned that if we expanded NATO too far eastward, this would blow up in our face. And of course, the end result is that Ukraine would be wrecked. It would be turned into a dysfunctional rump state. But we refused to believe that this was a problem. And you asked me why. I think there are two reasons. First of all, it all started during the unipolar moment. And during the unipolar moment, we were pursuing a policy of liberal hegemony. And we believed that it was not a threat to the Russians to expand NATO eastward. Michael McFaul has said to me that when he was ambassador to Moscow, he told Putin on numerous occasions that NATO expansion was not aimed at Russia, and it was not a threat to Moscow, and that Putin should relax. Putin, of course, didn't believe this. But I believe that many American policymakers believed that NATO expansion was not a threat to Russia, even though the Russians said it was. And they thought it was part of a benign strategy. The United States was a benign hegemon. So that, I think, is reason one we pushed it. And reason two, which I alluded to before, is that we were incredibly powerful and we thought we could just shove it down their throat. They may not like it, but that's their problem, not our problem. The United States is so powerful that it can just push NATO expansion as far as it wants. It can support an open door policy no matter what. And the Russians can't do much about it.